worship with Cimarron Valley Church, where ordinary people serve an extraordinary God. This week's message is over the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 2, verses 9 through 11, entitled Chasing the Wind. We now join Pastor Paul Dawson.
Thankful to be in the house of the Lord on a Sunday morning. Amen. Thank you, Ted, for your opening today. You were tiptoeing around my subject today, which is always a good sign that I guess that I'm on the right wavelength. So thank you for that. Thank you for sharing from your heart today. The scripture passage that I want to share with you today comes from the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter number 2. I could read the entire book of Ecclesiastes, 12 chapters, and we could call that the sermon because that's exactly what Solomon shared throughout the entire book. He shared so much about life and what life consists of and how we view life. I share this quite often with people when I talk. A lot of us, we live as if we're going to live forever here on earth. But do you realize that it's a very short time? Very short time. This past week, one of the astronauts from, I believe it was Apollo 8, 90 years old. He looked very strong, very viral still, in fact. When I saw his picture, I was quite intrigued by that. Actually, I guess he was in an airplane when he lost his life at 90. And 90 may sound to some of us here today as a long time. To others, doesn't sound long at all. Am I right? As life goes on, I don't know if you're like me, but I try to measure things. I measure things like this. I say to myself, my mother passed at 87. My father passed at 83. The average is 85. I got a ways to go. I measure things like that. But who says that I'll even make it through today? That's how short life can be. We think it's a long time. When you were 20, 50 sounded old. You may have even, like myself, worked with people that age, and you're thinking, man, that dude needs to retire. I mean, he can't even get off the back of a pickup. When you get 50 and you can't get off the back of a pickup by jumping like you did when you was 20, you're not ready to retire. And some youngster comes around and says, maybe you should hang it up. You look at him with a frown. Like, who you think you're talking to? Because in your mind, you're still young. It's still okay. As the years pass, when you say your age, how many of you say your age? I was hoping to trick her one more time. But it doesn't sound old to you, does it? It does not sound old to you. Others may feel differently. Your grandchildren, they got a lot to say about your age. Even your children. But you're fine with things. Solomon speaks a lot about that in his writing of Ecclesiastes. Now I'm going to share just a short. I realize now why you're all kind of uptight. You thought I was going to read the whole book, right? No. I'm only going to read 4 verses, okay? Today, I've chosen to read those verses from the New English Translation because they give us a clear understanding. And by the way, for those of you who may pick on that, it's an actual translation from the original Greek, putting it in the word that you would understand. Okay? So I'm going to read from the New English Translation today because it carries with it a weighty word that I want to talk to you about. So I'll begin in verse 9 of chapter 2, Ecclesiastes. And this is what Solomon says. So I was far wealthier than all my predecessors in Jerusalem, yet I maintained my objectivity. I did not restrain myself from getting whatever I wanted. I did not deny myself anything that would bring me pleasure. So all my accomplishments gave me joy. This was my reward for all my effort. Yet when I reflected on everything I had accomplished and on all the effort that I had expended to accomplish it, did you hear what he said here? When I thought back about what I have accomplished, and when I considered all the effort that I put, we often talk that way. Man, there's a lot of my blood, sweat, and tears in that. That's what Solomon is saying here. When I contemplated all the effort that I'd expended to accomplishment, I concluded all these achievements and possessions are ultimately profitless. And this is what I want to talk to you about this morning. Like chasing the wind, there's nothing gained from them on earth. So Solomon, when he begins this particular book of Ecclesiastes, we believe that it was later in his life, that it was actually in his possibly last days of his life, and that he was kind of sitting and maybe dictating a memoir for some scribe to write concerning his life and where all he had been. Now, just in case you don't know, Solomon was the son of David by Bathsheba, his mom. There was an affair that went on with David and Bathsheba that had been decades ago, now that we're speaking about Solomon, and here was his life. And the reason that I point that out to us is because lots of times we feel like life is, has dealt us a heavy blow, or we're not like normal, or we're unlike other people. Solomon possibly could have felt that way, for I'm sure that out in the kingdom there were whispers that were spoken about Solomon. Oh, he's that illegitimate kid of David's. Don't you suppose that was possibly said concerning Solomon? But yet God had a perfect place for him. Out of all the sons of David, and there were others, Solomon was the one that God had chosen to lead the nation of Israel, God's people. It was Solomon that he pulled out from among all the rest. Some of his brothers were great warriors. Some of his brothers were great politicians. But Solomon was the one that God chose to lead the nation. And now he is in his elderly years. His father David had passed decades prior to this. His mother was long gone. His brothers, some of them had met untimely deaths. And here he was in the final season of his life, and he begins to give like a biography along with a memoir of his life. And he's beginning to reflect back and think about all the things that he had passed through in his life, all the things that had happened to him. As a young fella, he was brought in to be the king. And as a young fella, he built that magnificent temple that sat there in Jerusalem. As a young fella, he built a palace for the king to dwell in, and courtyards and vineyards and all types of structures that he was a part of constructing. All through his life, these different things had happened. In fact, in one of the writings, he talks about the wife of his youth and how he had spoiled that in his life. He talked about, you can read about it in the Song of Solomon, and he talks about how life was when he was romantically involved with a person that was special in his life, his very wife. And then in another writing, he talks about how that it appears that he had all kinds of illicit affairs and how this had spoiled the beauty of that young romance. This was Solomon. Now he's sitting here as a gray, frail old man, and he's reciting to this scribe all about life. And he's talking about it in a way that he says it's just aimless. It just seems like I could never get it right. Is there anyone in here this morning that's ever felt that way? I just never get things right. Seems like I can just mess things up so bad. And Solomon began to speak like that, I believe, to his scribe as he's penning these words on parchment and sharing them with the rest of us. Because it begins in verse 1 of the text that I read for you. And if you'd put that up, it shows what he was saying. And so I'm going to go back through the chapter now, but I'll be quick, so don't fret. But it shows what he was saying, and this is what he says. He says that he put out a test. He said, I thought to myself. Have you ever thought to yourself? Got in a quiet place and just begin to reflect and think about what's probably most important to you, life. And Solomon said in verse 1 of chapter 2, after he had written all about nothing new under the sun in chapter 1, in chapter 2 he said, I just came and I just began to think to myself. And this is what he says. He says, come now, I will try self-indulgent pleasure to see if it's worthwhile. But I found that it also is futile. I said of partying, it's folly, and of self-indulgent pleasure, it accomplishes nothing. What was he saying? He said, I made all the comedy clubs. I went down and listened. I had a laugh or two. I enjoyed myself for a short season. But when I left there, just like you, I couldn't remember the joke. I couldn't remember what made me laugh. I couldn't remember the story. And I thought how futile that was. He didn't say that it was wrong. He just said it lost its meaning. Not only that, in verse 3 he says something else. He said, I thought deeply then about the effects, are you all listening to this? Of indulging myself with wine. I thought I'd run down to the local tavern. And I'd just sit there with all the good old boys. And we'd talk, you know. This old man and me. You ever heard that song? Yeah. We just sat and talked. And now through that song, he tells a story about what they sat and talked about. Huh? Then he said along about 2 a.m., I said goodbye to him, and I never saw that man again. Huh? Solomon said, I thought maybe that would be what I needed to do. We'd just go down there and sit with the working crowd, with with the good old boys and just share with them. But what's he say? He says, but the effects of behaving foolishly so that I might discover what is profitable. In other words, he's saying, they just looked happy, but I found out that that wasn't happiness. That wasn't a true, deep feeling happiness for people to do on earth during the few days of their lives. He was talking about the pleasures of a worldly life. And Solomon says, I indulged myself in those things, but I didn't find true peace, joy, or happiness in those things. I made friends, I had acquaintances, and I knew people, but it just didn't seem to really sit with me. Anybody relate to that? Sure. So then there was something else he did. It's called the projects of a working life. So he didn't find it at the comedy club, and he didn't find it down at the bar room, so he thought he would just go work. He could find it there. That's where he would find happiness and joy in life. So listen to what he did. Verse 4 of that same chapter, he said, I increased my possessions. I built houses for myself. I planted vineyards for myself. I designed royal gardens and parks for myself. I planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I constructed pools of water for myself. Pools of water. I don't even have a pool. But he had pools of water. He had courtyards and vineyards. He had houses, not one house, houses that he had constructed. He said, I purchased male and female slaves. I had servants at my beck and call. Ring a little bell and here they come. What is it now, sir? Sir Solomon, what can we do for you? Then he says, I own slaves who were born in my house. In other words, they had been with him for so long that they were now actually parents of servants in his house. He said, I had it all. I got all that stuff. I was involved in all these projects. He said, I also possessed, he didn't just say livestock. Let me tell you how he said it. I had more than anybody. That's what he says. I possessed more livestock. And then he said, both herds, cattle, and flocks, sheep, than any of my predecessors in Jerusalem. I had it all. You couldn't have more than Solomon had. He had it all. It was there, he said, whatever I wanted, I got. If I went down to look at one of my houses and I didn't like the courtyard of that house, I had it redone. My servants would redo it. Can't you imagine what the landscaping looked around Solomon's houses, the courtyards, the vineyards, the pool, huh? I see it right now. Happy birds flying in the spring and a big fountain out in front of his big white mansion, huh? A grape harbor over on the side. Servants out there making sure that the grass doesn't get too tall. Are you guys still in dream world? Or this was Solomon. He said, the projects of a working life, I threw myself into them. But you know what happened? After a while, there was nothing else to build. After a while, there was nothing else to do. After a while, I didn't need another pool. I didn't need another house. I didn't need another vineyard. I didn't need another servant. It was just full. I just got so full. that I didn't need anything else. Which brings me to the last thing that he spoke to us about, the possessions of a wealthy life, found in verse 8 of the same chapter. He says, I amassed silver and gold for myself. I got everything for myself. I built houses for myself. I built courtyards for myself. I did vineyards for myself. I built pools for myself. I had more cattle and more sheep than anybody in the land. I had it for myself. And then he says he has the possessions of a wealthy life because he has silver and gold for myself, as well as valuable treasures taken from kingdoms and provinces. So politically, he was strong as well. Other governments that existed in the time of Solomon looked to Solomon. He was the free world leader. He was it. He said, I had all those things. Remember now, he is telling his memoir to his scribe as he's penning these words. He's letting him, I had all these things. He said, let me tell you something else I had. I acquired male and female singers for myself. I had my own entertainment. I had my own DJ. I had my own quartet. I had my own group. Huh? I had Kenny Loggins, for heaven's sake. He was right there. I had everything I needed. And I'd just say, sing. And he'd sing. And I'd say to her, sing. She'd sing. I had it all for myself. I sat alone up in my great palace. And I'd say to my servants, bring the singers in. Let's have a show. And they put on a show for him. He had it all. He had it all. And then he says, and what gives a man sensual delight but a harem of beautiful concubines? He didn't even have any ugly people around him. He had all pretty people around him. Hollywood stars around him. You know? This was Solomon. What did he have to say about all these pleasures and these possessions and these projects? In his memoir, what did he say? Well, I'm glad you asked, because I found it in verse number 11 of our text. He said, then I looked on all the works that my hands had done, and on the labor in which I had toiled. And indeed, all was vanity. It just came to nothing. Because he realized that from the day he was born, he was on a path. Now, this is going to shock you this morning, but you really need to hear this. You realize that you were put on a path when you were born. And this path eventually ends in death. And you can take nothing with you. Are you kidding me, man? The courtyards, the pools, the houses, the servants, the comedy club, the singers, the entertainment, the silver, the gold, the beautiful harem he had. No, it's all going to get left to Junior. And Lord only knows what Junior will do with it. Means nothing to him. Here's what he says. All was vanity, and all was a chasing of the wind. Let me tell you something about chasing the wind. You can chase it, but you will never catch it, and you will never contain it. If you're looking for joy and happiness and harmony and peace in the things about you, you're missing it, man. You're missing it. It's not going to happen. It'll be a fleeting moment of happiness, but not a deep-centered joy. There is a difference between happiness and joy. Happiness is temporal. It only lasts for a moment. Run down to the comedy club, and hear a joke that makes you laugh. That's happy. Huh? That's happy. Slide into a brand new car and feel that and smell that aroma of a new vehicle. That's happiness. Sadness is first month payment. But if you have joy, it goes beyond the happiness, because joy is something that becomes permanent to you. The joy of the Lord in your heart. God in your life. That's what makes all the difference. And all through the 12 chapters that I threatened to read for you today, I just skipped over to the last chapter, okay? And I went all the way to the last verse. Rhonda can put it up for you. You need to read this. Are you chasing the wind today? Here's what Solomon said. He said, having heard everything, I have reached this conclusion. Now, let me remind you, he's one of the wisest men to ever walk on the face of the earth. Let me remind you that Jesus even spoke of him. And this is what he said. His conclusion was to fear God and keep his commandments. That's a good thing to do. And then he said, because this is the whole duty of man. It wasn't the projects, the pleasures, the possessions. They were just chasing the wind. But something permanent is a relationship with the Lord Jesus Christ. And that's something that you take with you when you die. It's the only thing you take with you when you die. You can't take anything from this world. It will not pass through the door. It's left. It's gone. Because your path ended right here. Then he says, for God will evaluate every deed, including every secret thing. And Solomon had a lot of secrets, both good and evil. Solomon said, you can't catch the wind. You don't even know where it comes from, nor where it goes. It just makes a big circle around the globe and comes all the way back again. Maybe a little lighter this time, maybe a little stronger, depending on the elements up in the atmosphere. But you can't catch the wind. You can't contain the wind. You can't control the wind. You might chase the wind, but you're grasping at something that has absolutely no substance. And that's what Solomon said about his possessions, his projects, and his pleasures. They had no substance. But fearing God and keeping his commandments, there is substance.